Hey everybody, we are going to continue talking about ancient Greece, only this time, this is the last section in the chapter really. We're going to talk about, well, no, next to last, we're going to talk about Alexander the Great and then the civilization that he started. So Alexander the Great was a young prince who came from a part of Greece way up in the northern region called Macedonia. His dad was a king, King Philip II of Macedonia, and he didn't want to just be limited to Macedonia, he wanted to conquer all of Greece. So Philip II spent his lifetime as the monarch, making sure that the rest of Greece would bow down to him. Now, after Athens and Sparta had exhausted each other and themselves in the Peloponnesian War, another Greek state began to get bigger and stronger, and that's Macedonia. Macedonia was ruled by Philip II. He used his army, which included phalanxes, which was the Greek way of arranging your soldiers, and heavy cavalry to crush many of the other Greek city-states. A famous politician from Athens named Demosthenes kept warning the people of Athens, look, if we don't do something now while he's still 100 miles away, he's just going to keep conquering cities, and he won't stop until he's taken Athens. Nobody really paid attention to Demosthenes, and so it wasn't until Philip II and his armies were right near Athens that anybody except for Demosthenes paid him any attention, and by then it was much too late. Eventually, Demosthenes was listened to, but too late. Philip took over all of Greece, but at his daughter's wedding, he was murdered. He was assassinated. Some people say that his wife was part of the assassination plot, so that she could rule the country under the control of her young son, who was around 16 at the time, 15 or 16. Alexander was officially king. Some people say that Alexander himself was in on the plot that murdered his dad. Nobody's really sure at this point. Alexander had been a student of the great thinker Aristotle. You remember that because Aristotle was a student of Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates. And it was there at the Lyceum, which was the school of Aristotle. It was there at the Lyceum that Alexander the Great had studied the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, a great war story. And Alexander decided that being a warrior was better than anything else. So Alexander the Great spent his young life and his entire life being a warrior king. He crushed a small rebellion in Greece that started shortly after his dad died. The Greeks thought, oh look, Philip's gone, let's take back control for ourselves. Well, no, because Alexander the Great was great, and he crushed that rebellion quickly. And then he turned his attention to destroying an older empire that had long been threatening Greece, the Persians. Alexander attacked Emperor Darius. This is a different Darius. This is like Xerxes' grandson or so, not Xerxes' dad, Darius. So this is Darius III, I think it is. So he attacked Emperor Darius' armies time and time again. He won every single battle. On one occasion, Darius' mom and his wife both showed up at the battlefield to watch, and when Darius lost, he ran away with the rest of his army that could follow him, and unfortunately for him, abandoned his own mom and his own wife. They were captured by Alexander the Great, and they switched sides. So, imagine being a commander in a war, but being so bad at it that your mom and your wife switch sides to support your enemy. That's how Darius was. Eventually, after another battle in the future of that, after another battle, he was assassinated by his own bodyguards. Darius's bodyguards were like, this is just repetitive and awful. Our entire army is going to get slaughtered if we keep fighting battles. Why don't we just kill him? So his own bodyguards killed Darius and surrendered to Alexander. Alexander then went on to conquer the entire Persian Empire. He took control of Egypt and Persia all the way towards India. He put his own generals in control of the different regions of the land. He set up new capital cities and named every single capital city all over the empire Alexandria. That's right, he named them all for himself. What a humble, kind guy. So there were a bunch of Alexandrias all around the empire. Every capital city was an Alexandria. He tried to create a new master race of people. See, he figured his Greek generals were better than any other men anywhere in the empire. But there were very beautiful princesses in India, and beautiful princesses in Persia, and in Turkey, and in Egypt. And so he arranged for all of his generals to get married to princesses from Egypt and Turkey and Persia and India. And then the plan was that when these women got pregnant with the Greek generals' sons, he, Alexander the Great, would take custody of all of those children and raise all those kids as his own personal family with him as their father and start a new master race of people. Pretty messed up. But he never actually got the chance to live out that plan, because just as soon as he conquered all of that territory all over the empire, his soldiers wanted to go home. Like, there was no more territory that they could reasonably conquer, so they weren't going to get rich from conquering more area. And rather than become farmers 1,000 miles away from home, they wanted to go home. And so they talked to Alexander, and the generals talked to Alexander, and eventually they convinced him that it was time to just run the empire from home. Let's go home. Let's let the men see their wives and their kids. They haven't seen them in 4 or 5 years. Let's go home. On the way back, Alexander partied with his men. See, Alexander was the kind of general and the kind of king who spent time with his men, not just with his generals, but with his men. He was the commander of one of his cavalry regiments, in addition to being king and commander-in-chief. He was just an officer in one of his own regiments. He drank with the men, had a lot of alcohol, and on one occasion, he might have already been feeling kind of ill, and then he engaged in a drinking party with his buddies, with his men in his regiment, and he got alcohol poisoning, which spiked with a fever. And just before he died from it, his men, his generals, came to him and said, "Your Majesty, it looks like you might not survive this. You don't have any children of your own. Who should take over after your death?" And Alexander the Great responded to them, "Whoever's the strongest." And then he died. Now, with a bunch of super macho, rough, tough generals, you really don't want to just say who's the strongest unless you're ready for them to fight it out. And that's exactly what happened. His generals decided to take their own armies and go against the other generals. Eventually, 3 emerged as the top leaders, and they knew that they weren't going to take out either of the other 2, so they made a compromise. One of them took over Greece and Turkey, one of them took over Egypt, and one of them took over Persia and India. So that's the way that Alexander the Great's empire goes from being massive and gigantic in a very short time to being fractured and splintered and not cooperating with each other. Interestingly, you've heard of the princess Cleopatra, the Egyptian princess Cleopatra, I'm sure. Well, Cleopatra was not really Egyptian. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the Greek general who conquered Egypt in this split, this 3-way split of Alexander the Great's empire. So she and her brother both were great-great-grandchildren of a Greek general named Ptolemy. So that was Chapter 5, Section 4, Alexander the Great and the world he created. Now, Alexander the Great's world was called the Hellenistic Empire. And that is Chapter 5, Section 5, which we're going to do right now, because we've only been 10 minutes into the episode so far, and I figure after another 10 minutes, that'll make really a full episode. So, Alexander the Great and his empire. When Alexander the Great mixed the cultures of Egypt, plus Persia, plus India, plus Greece, he created a brand new culture called the Hellenistic culture. Hellenes is what the Greeks call Greece, Hellenes. So the Hellenistic culture is just another way of saying Greek, but a different time period's language for the word Greek. The city of Alexandria, remember there was a ton of different Alexandrias, so which one? The one in Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt, became like the commercial headquarters, the intellectual headquarters of Alexander the Great's empire. If you wanted to make money, you went to Alexandria, Egypt. If you wanted access to all the greatest books and learning, you went to Alexandria, Egypt. Landmarks in Alexandria included a gigantic lighthouse, the world's greatest library, and Alexander the Great's tomb. The very first museum was in Alexandria, Egypt as well. Now, interesting, when you think about it, where does the word museum come from? What relationship does it have to anything? Well, in Greece, the Muses are goddesses that protect arts and learning. And so the Muses would have a headquarters where they would keep great art and learning, a museum, the headquarters of the Muses. By the way, if you go to Boston and you look up in the center of the spiral staircase, the staircase isn't spiral, but it leads to a dome. That's what I meant. I'm sorry. The dome at the top of the staircase, and you can also see the dome from one floor underneath it exactly. It's a picture of the arts being protected by the Muses. They're holding shields up to protect the arts, sculpture, painting, and architecture from the god of time, Kronos, who is coming down with a big scythe, a sickle, something that reaps, something that cuts the living plants from a farm. So he's coming down on the arts, ready to kill them. Time is ready to destroy the arts. But the Muses are all protecting the arts. And that's what a museum does. It protects art, architecture, and sculpture from the ravages of time. So the art that's inside that dome at the top of the staircase at the Boston Fine Arts Museum is a literal indication of what the building is for itself, a museum. So Aristarchus was a great thinker during the Hellenistic period. He was a person who studies the stars and the universe. And what do we call someone who studies the stars and the universe? Like Neil deGrasse Tyson, like Carl Sagan. You probably won't recognize the name Carl Sagan unless your parents are really old school and have Cosmos on DVD or something. Astronomers are the people who study the stars and the universe. Aristarchus was a great astronomer. He figured out that the sun has to be much larger than planet Earth, and that we go around the sun, not the other way around. The sun doesn't go around the Earth. Ptolemy was another, even more famous astronomer and scientist of the Hellenistic period, and he said, no, the Earth sits at the center of the universe, and everything goes around the Earth. So Ptolemy was wrong, Aristarchus was right. Eratosthenes was another great scientist, and he measured, in order to find out how tall and how big the Earth is, he actually measured the pyramids with a shadow experiment to figure out how big the Earth is. Um, he found the curvature of the Earth's surface based on multiple pyramids in different places and how big their shadows were at the same time. He knew the pyramids were as big as each other, but if one casts a longer shadow than another at exactly the same time of day, then the Earth's surface is curved and not just flat. He also figured out how tall the pyramids were because he waited until the sun was at exactly the right point in the sky to make his own shadow be the same as his height. So he was like 5'7", and he waited until his shadow was 5'7". And then he had people waiting on his command to measure the shadow of a pyramid. He couldn't climb the pyramid. You couldn't figure out how tall it was accurately. But when the pyramid shadow was the same height as itself, he measured the pyramid shadow and learned how tall it was. A mathematician named Euclid wrote the first ever book of geometry called The Elements. Archimedes was another great thinker at this time who found out the value for pi, 3.14, blah, blah, blah. And he invented the Archimedes screw as a way of removing water from a well. So basically, you just spin the water up and don't let it go back down again because you've got an airtight surface. You bring it up on a screw. He studied the amazing power of pulleys and levers as well. So Archimedes, great thinker. Hellenistic philosophy and Hellenistic art. Well, there were two big philosophies in this time period. There was Stoicism and Epicureanism. Today, Stoicism is still around. You'll hear someone described as being very stoic sometimes. You won't really hear about Epicureanism as a philosophy, but you will hear about it in terms of food. Now, Stoics. Who were the Stoics? The Stoics said you need to live peacefully by observing nature. Don't get excited. Don't get freaked out. Just study nature, watch, learn how things go, and go along with the will of the gods. If something happens to you that's really lucky, don't freak out like, yay, good luck. If something happens to you that's horrible, don't be like, oh, this is awful. So really, no optimism and no pessimism. You just accept things as they are. Don't get emotional about things. So if you call someone stoic, it's because they never show emotion. Like if you know a person who just kind of goes through life like, yep, okay, no problem. They never get super happy. They never get super sad. They're stoic. Now, Epicureans, led by a guy named Epicurus, told people to focus on your five senses. Your sight, your smelling, your hearing, your touching, and your taste. Focus on the five senses. Take in everything you can take in with your five senses. And avoid pain by being good and doing good things. Don't overdo things. Be in moderation. Don't gorge yourself. Don't go crazy like going overboard, right? So that's Epicureanism, the old style. Today, it's taken on a different meaning. If someone says that's an Epicurean delight, what they mean is that tastes incredible. So Epicureanism nowadays doesn't mean all five senses. It mostly means your sense of taste. So something is Epicurean if it has to do with eating at a restaurant, trying some gourmet food. Okay. One of the most famous bronze sculptures was the Colossus of Rhodes. It was a massive bronze hollow sculpture where one foot was on one side of a harbor and the other foot was on the other side of the harbor, and ships are sailing underneath the statue all the time. And it's just this giant statue that goes up into the sky of a person. And it's called the Colossus because that's the word for a gigantic, huge person. So the Colossus of Rhodes. Unfortunately, it came down, after a big earthquake. So the Colossus of Rhodes statue does not exist anymore. Another great sculpture of this time period was the Nike of Samothrace. Nike is the Greek goddess of victory. And it's also what Phidippides said when he finished his marathon run from the beach at Marathon to Athens to tell the people, we won, don't surrender. We won. Nike. So Nike in this statue, which is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, it's at the top of a staircase. The Nike was originally this gigantic stone marble statue of the goddess of victory with her wings. The goddess of victory is winged. So the wings are flying out behind her. Her arms were coming ahead of her, holding a crown. And that crown was going to be put on the head of an admiral, a Greek admiral who won a great victory against Persia. And so this admiral, a statue of the admiral, was going to be in the middle of a water fountain, and Nike was going to be flying down using her outstretched wings and putting a crown on the head of this victorious admiral. Unfortunately, the water fountain doesn't exist anymore, the statue of the Greek admiral doesn't exist anymore, and neither do the Nike's head or arms. So what we have is a statue of a goddess with a torso and wings flying out behind her. And it's actually a pretty impressive, attractive statue. So the Nike of Samothrace is one of the greatest statues of the ancient world, and it's currently in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Hellenistic art is different than the art of Athens during the Golden Age. Early Greek art and art from Athens' Golden Age generally is like polite and calm. The art is very fancy in terms of it being simple and elegant, but it's not exciting or dramatic. That's Hellenistic art. The art of Alexander's time period and the people after Alexander, the art of the Hellenistic world is very dramatic. It's guys in poses as if they were World Wrestling Federation wrestlers. They're doing exciting things. They're fighting snakes and battling each other. And whereas the standard classical Greek art from the Athenian period is more a person who's relaxed and maybe holding a spear or holding some athletic equipment. But they're very balanced. They're not exciting. They're not trying to do something that's super eye-catching. But Hellenistic statues are. They are very exciting and dramatic. They tell really, really suspenseful stories. So that's the difference. Kind of the difference between a spy movie that's very undercover, very secretive, but doesn't have a car chase, compared to like a Mission Impossible style spy movie where there's all kinds of use of the martial arts and car chases and missile launches, right? So that's very much the difference in style between Greek statues. There's classical, which is very polite, very refined, very calm and balanced. And then there's Hellenistic, which is exciting and dynamic, and the body's twisted and contorted into exciting ways. So, around the year 150 BC, even the Hellenistic world was falling apart because there was a new empire on the block, and they were coming to take over everything. And they were the Romans. And that's what we'll be doing next in chapter 6. Thanks.